Hello, everyone, and welcome to another week of the Australia Institute's Climate Academy. I'm Glenn Connley, Senior Media Advisor here at the Australia Institute, coming to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today, we're putting our Anthony Green hats on and looking at the political pendulum to work out which seats may fall in the May 3 federal election, whether the issue of climate change will play a part in the changing of seats, and is there such a thing as a safe seat these days? Now, back in the bad old days, we used to read the Morgan or Gallup poll just before the election. We'd come up with a projected swing, and then we'd apply it to the pendulum to decide whether a government would survive or fall. A 2% swing back then was considered pretty big. We might see 5 or 6 seats fall. A 3% swing was a whopper and might see 10 seats change hands. But that was in the days of the major parties getting 40+% of the primary vote each. Now, with minor parties and independents getting about a third of the primary vote, it's not so simple. Joining me again is the Australia Institute's Director of Strategy, Leanne Minshull. Hi, Leanne. Climate change was one of the key issues behind the election in 2022. We saw a whole bunch of Teals pick up seats off the back of the issue of climate change and environmental concerns. Is climate change an issue at this 2025 election?
Thanks, Glenn, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And just to let you know that Amy Remeikis will be with us in a moment. She's just getting mic'd up, or whatever the technical term is. And we'll dive in with her to a few more of the specific seats, because hopefully people would have been following along on Amy's blog. It's been very popular. It's on every day other than the weekends, and she's got a much better idea of what particular seats may or may not flip. Just going to the question, though, about environment, of course, everybody's been talking about the fact that it's a cost of living election, but that may be what's taking the mind of the pollsters and a lot of the media. But I think it's important to remember that climate change is still very high in the minds of voters. So if we go back to the Australia Institute, here's Amy. Hello.
Hello. All organised.
Excellent.
Technical problems today.
Well, you're looking very, very lovely in pink, Amy. So just talking about climate change overall, and is it an issue at this election? And I was just going to our polling that we do every year, Climate of the Nation. I think we've been doing it, well, definitely for over a decade, not exactly sure exactly how long. But something that everybody's also talking about at this election is that it's a shift, it's a generational shift. And now the boomers aren't going to be the majority. Everybody seems to leave out Generation X. I don't know what's happened to us. I just scrape into Gen X at the older age. But of course, everyone's talking about millennials and that voting bloc. And our polling has showed that people between 18 and 24, it's around 65% of those voters think really specifically that the government should introduce a polluter pays tax. So we're not even talking about vague terms. Are young people worried about the climate? Yeah, they're worried about the climate, because as much as they want to own a house, there's no point owning a house if it's going to burn down or get flooded out, because we're not addressing climate change issues. But they're actually getting quite specific into policy issues. So it's not a vague thing. It's a very particular thing. And if you look at the other side of that, to the older generation, and everybody says that there's a lot of commentary about they're worried about cost of living, and climate change doesn't get a mention as much. But we did some polling last week on the new gas policy from the from the opposition, sorry. And one thing that we polled on a lot of things, do you think that gas should be taxed? But something that we were very interested in was to see if Australians agreed that there was no shortage of gas. Now, why is this important to climate? It's important to climate because it's pretty hard to get Australians to agree to not opening up new gas fields if they think the lights are about to go off because there's a shortage in gas. So we asked specifically if people thought there were shortages of gas, and guess who? One of the biggest cohorts of people who were, really convinced that there was no shortage of gas wasn't Melbourne, wasn't Sydney. It was regional Queensland, with blokes 65 years and over. Wow. So we're talking heartland, Liberal Party voters here are now convinced, thanks to the opposition, that there is no shortage of gas in Australia. So that will mean that it's much easier for whoever forms government after the election to then go on to the next, logical step in the process, and not open up more gas just to ship overseas. So it's a pincer movement in a way. You've got the young generation really wanting to have climate change addressed in a way that's real and that's very policy specific. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got older Australians who may not have climate change right front and centre in their head. These ones, other older people are concerned. There's a massive cohort of people worried about their grandkids. But even on the kind of right of politics where we might be thinking that people aren't as concerned about climate change, they sure know there's no gas shortage now. So I think climate's everywhere, and it's going to be a massive issue this election and also after the election.
Thanks, Leanne. So that's what people care about. What about what the politicians, particularly the leaders of the major parties, are talking about? Amy, it seems to me that sometimes our leaders don't think voters can walk and chew gum at the same time. So we're less concerned about the climate and the environment because there's a cost of living crisis. Do you reckon that's true?
Yeah, I mean, everything Leanne just said is absolutely true. It is how voters are feeling. And the absence of climate in this election is like a giant blinking, flashing light where you've got voters all over the place, no matter what their age, what their demographic, or where they're living, saying, you're not talking about the giant burning elephant in the room, and that is a problem for me. But what political parties, particularly the major political parties, tend to often mistakenly do is that they make assumptions about what people care about based on those headline issues that people are responding to them about. So cost of living in this particular instance, because that's what the media has focused on. That's what's coming back in their research as one of the #1 issues. And that's when they're talking to people on the street, they're usually talking to them about cost of living and the minutiae of daily life. And so what they've done is they've gone, well, this is all anyone cares about. And what that means is that they assume that voters can't walk and chew gum at the same time, as to your point, and that therefore they only care about cost of living. They'll only be voting on cost of living, and they're not actually making any policies for the future, which is what they consider climate to fall in. They think that climate is something that is a future policy, a future worry. The big mistake that they're making, and we're seeing this in the Greens campaigns, we're seeing this in the independent campaigns that are really tapping in to voter discontent, is that people do care about climate. They care about cost of living, yes, but they're very capable of saying, and also we're very worried about what is happening in our climate space, and neither major party seems to want to address this. The other reason why the major parties don't want to address it is because, the coalition don't have a great story to tell when it comes to climate. They didn't while they were in government, and they've been in government for the last 15 of the last 24 years or so, I think. So they haven't had a great story to tell on climate. And while they are absolutely correct on gas, and as Leanne has said, has now given cover for both major parties to change their thinking on gas in this country, they don't have any other options. And Labor don't particularly want to talk about it because while they've been slightly better than the coalition, they've still been pretty shit when it comes to climate overall. They're still opening up fossil fuel projects. They're still talking about expanding fossil fuel projects. And even their energy policy, which is, the shift to renewables, it still has in there that they will be relying on gas to 2050 and beyond, and that they want to open up more gas fields in order to be able to do that. And so that has confused the message so much that Labor basically is saying, we don't want to talk about climate because we're going to get hit on both sides now, so we're just going to pretend that it doesn't exist.
We are off and running on the Australia Institute's Climate Academy for this week. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Leanne. Back to you guys in a moment. First, a bit of housekeeping. You can ask your questions for our panellists using the Q&A box and upvote other people's questions. I'm already seeing some lovely comments. Thanks very much. Keep them coming in. Ask your questions anytime. Don't wait till the end, and we'll do our best to get answers for you. Keep things nice in the chat. Any bad or abusive language will get you kicked out. And finally, this is a live event. It is being recorded. and the video will be available on the Australia Institute website. That's the australiainstitute.org.au. So let's get back to the issue at hand. When it comes to elections, we journalists have a few absolute must-use phrases: battleground seat, safe seat. But what is a safe seat these days? The most recent election in Australia was the WA state election a few weeks ago, where in so many seats we saw swings in the teens, in the 20%. So we know the electorate is volatile. Voters are hungry for an alternative to the two major parties, and fewer voters than ever before could call themselves nailed on Labor or Liberal voters. So, Amy, let's get right back to the issue and talk about the seats. Where is climate change an issue in this election, and which seats could it help decide on May the 3rd?
Climate is actually an issue in every electorate. It's just not one that the major parties are responding to, but it is definitely an issue that is popping up in every electorate. It's really interesting in Nationals electorates this time round. If you speak to anyone in the National Party or, in the community independent scene, Cowper is probably going to go independent. The Nationals are now privately admitting this, where they're saying that we've lost Cowper, which is huge because it's not on the national agenda, because it's not one of those seats that people thought was necessarily going to go independent this time round. So it hasn't been where the focus in. So what basically they're having to do is direct resources into Cowper to try and hold it. So that shows you the power of Kaz's campaign there. And it's basically been on who is addressing climate, who is addressing integrity, who is addressing assurance. Insurance has also been a massive, massive issue in the electorate of Wannon, which is held by the Liberals' Dan Tehan. Insurance and roads is what keeps coming up, and insurance being linked to climate change because elements of Wannon were in, like little towns in Wannon were involved in a massive hailstorm that some people may remember happened late last year, which caused huge amounts of damage. It was unseasonable. It was like, one of those 1 in 100 year storms, thanks climate change, and people are now finding out that they're either underinsured or they don't actually have insurance for it. So that's an electorate where it's really mattering. The Greens electorate, so where they're targeting, Brisbane, Ryan and Griffith, climate is still a massive issue there. And why? That's because Brisbane completely understands what it is like when it floods, because they live with this, year on, year out. There is always the worry that the Brisbane River is going to break its banks during massive, massive storms. We're also seeing climate be an issue in the seat of Leichhardt, where Labor is trying to tackle the LNP there, and Leichhardt, even though it's in North Queensland and people don't tend to think of it this way, actually is a massive green area because they rely on climate for tourism. They rely on tourism. So they really need green policies because they understand the impact that climate change is going to have on the reef. Then you go to electorates like Sydney, where Tanya Plibersek won't lose her seat, but she is facing a massive backlash because of Labor's environmental and climate policies, which is meaning that Labor is going to have to address this. We move into Melbourne and you've got seats like Wills, which Labor is looking to lose to the Greens because climate is a massive issue there, and they've managed to be able to identify that Labor is not responding to climate as they promised. And then you go into Tasmania and we see Franklin, which is currently held by the Fisheries Minister, Julie Collins. That's under a huge amount of pressure, and we could see the independent take that one again because people on the ground are responding to concerns and their general disbelief that the major parties are not responding to their own concerns, because voters do think about the future. Voters who live in these communities that are directly impacted by the impacts of climate change are responding to these concerns and looking to the major parties and saying, oh, yes, Lorraine has just said Monash electorate. Absolutely, Monash is wide open at the moment and could be taken by an independent, partly because Russell Broadbent is splitting the vote there. He was the former Liberal member who was disendorsed and is now running as an independent, but also partly because we often underestimate that regional communities understand climate in a way that the major parties don't think that they do, and it's because their livelihoods depend on it. So it's no surprise to me that regional Queensland is going, oh, hey, yeah, no, we should be keeping more of our gas here. It's no surprise to me that Nationals electorates are going independent because they don't feel that they're being represented. Because overall, you are seeing the major parties go to the vested interests of the fossil fuel companies. You're seeing the Minerals Council, the gas industry, all of them set the policy agenda. The Nationals used to represent farmers. They now represent the mining industry, and their electorates are punishing them for it.
Wow, that's an extraordinary list of seats.
Can I just, Glenn, pick up on one of the things around Wannon and insurance? I don't know if people heard this morning, but there was a story on Radio National talking about some Climate Council research that came out, and I can't remember the electorate they were talking about, but they were talking about the fact it's almost, it's getting harder and harder, nigh on impossible to get insurance in that electorate. And the Australia Institute's also done research on this around the problems that insurance is causing for people, because, we now have people who can't afford insurance, which creates all sorts of problems around their mortgages, because you're supposed to be insured if you've got a mortgage, for example. Anyway, it's a whole other webcast. What are we on now?
Webinar.
Webinar. Couldn't remember where I was. It's a whole other webinar on that. But what I thought was interesting for this webinar is that neither of the major political parties would comment when RN contacted them. So they had a piece of research that was electorally based that said this was a problem, and neither major party wants to talk about it. I think that's extraordinary, and I don't think that they'll be able to keep going with that. And back to Amy's point about people looking for points of differentiation between the parties, and there is a small amount of differentiation between, well, depending on which way you're looking at it. There is differentiation between Labor and Liberal on climate, particularly around renewables, but not so much when it's around fossil fuels. But if people aren't seeing much differentiation in cost of living policies, they will start to look for differentiation in other things that they're concerned about, like climate. I don't think that the Labor Party is going to take it up, but there was actually, I think, potential at this election to differentiate themselves even more on climate, and that would have, helped them get a higher primary vote. And the other thing I wanted to pick up on was, I can't remember what seat it was you were talking about, Amy, I think was where you said that there was a split in the Liberal vote because
Monash,
because the same thing is happening in Franklin. So I just saw a tweet this morning from Kevin Bonham, a cephalogist from Tasmania, and I haven't had time to go and have a look at the EMRS poll. So this is secondhand news, but Kevin's usually pretty spot on with his numbers, if not his analysis. I shouldn't say that, but Kevin and I all have had bashed heads over analysis over the years, but his numbers are usually always spot on. And in Franklin, Julie Collins is sitting on 38% primary. So that puts her in quite a dangerous zone if we're talking about what seats are safe. The Liberals are in the mid-20s, low to mid-20s, but there's a previously Liberal candidate that's now running as an independent, who is also a former mayor, and he's peeled off 7%. Now, that's a fair amount of the vote, and the Greens are on 13, and the independent there, Peter George, is also on 13. So that seat is going to be a really interesting one, and it is absolutely, it's the salmon issue, obviously, but it's an environmental issue that's taking up everybody's time. But it's all that anybody's talking about in that electorate, and it's going to be a very interesting one to watch.
And I've just seen in the comments there, sorry, Glenn, people are mentioning Bullwinkle. The Nationals are pulling their resources out of Bullwinkle because they don't think that there is any chance they could win it there. And again, WA is an amazing case of the party seeing something that is not playing out in reality. Labor's vote is holding in WA, which is a surprise to the coalition, but Labor is losing grounds to people like the Greens, like independents, because there are more for people who are living with the impacts of the gas industry and looking around and saying this isn't exactly right for us. And we saw that play out in the state election, which Leanne was all across, and noticed this well before many election analysts did, which was that the Greens actually increased their vote in WA and now hold the balance of power in their upper house. But then when you look at previous safe seats like Fremantle, like around there, you saw an independent from a startup campaign almost take that seat from Labor. And they're running again in the federal election, and they've got a really good chance of diverting some of that vote, you know, and taking that as, you know, taking that protest vote. And while it may not happen in this election, it's really important to remember, like, you know, campaigns like Kate Hewlett's and others like in McPherson and Forest and other places where we're seeing independents start to lay down a campaign, is that these are usually two election strategies, so that you get the name recognition, you get people interested in your issues, and then you continue campaigning into the next term. And we have seen that happen across Australia, where independents are then able to take the seat. Indi is a great example of how, you know, how that community independent mold can really take hold. And so while we're talking about no safe seats, it's not just this election to watch, it's the campaign that happens during the term of Parliament, because Leanne is completely right. The major parties will not be able to ignore climate and other issues like they have in the campaign, because voters are turning against them. Their primary vote is dropping even as this campaign continues, and it has been in each news for like 3 or 4 news polls. We're seeing their primary vote start to drop, but it's dropping across the years that we've held elections, where people, as you said, Glenn, are no longer rusted off, and we're having more and more voters start to look for people who are reflecting their concerns. So don't just look at the results this election, look at what is happening immediately after the election and how those campaigns continue to take hold.
Leanne, are there any seats where you didn't expect climate to be a factor, but now it is?
Probably, but I still want to stay on Fremantle for a minute.
Yep.
I just think it's really interesting. So Kate Hewlett, as Amy said, ran in the state election, and what I found really interesting about that. So Mark Ogue, our senior gas analyst, and I went over and did an event in Fremantle to talk about gas. And I was, one, surprised at how many people turned up for a yarn about gas and how passionate the people were in Fremantle. And the other thing that really impressed me was that the independent was really brave in what she was doing. So, you know, there's none of this sort of just keep your head low appeal on a superficial level. In a state that supposedly we're told is, you know, right behind the gas industry. And when you are in Perth, you do feel it, right? You're walking through the city and there's Woodside and there's Rio Tinto, and it's very much in everything. This independent ran full throttle on, no, we have to look after the climate and gas is a problem. And rather than being, you know, trashed for that, as Amy said, she almost took the seat off a sitting state ALP minister, and the count went on for days and days and days. So I don't know much about Kate's campaign for the federal election, but I really admired the way that she put what she was concerned with and what the community clearly was concerned with front and centre, and showed what I think is lacking a little bit in our political leaders at the moment, and that's bravery and courage. And it certainly wasn't always like that. I remember growing up as a kid, I looked up to politicians. I thought that they made very brave stances, very brave statements. And I think that's what we're seeing from some of the younger independents coming through, and they're getting rewarded for it. And as Amy said, it may not be at this election, it may be a two election strategy, but it will happen and we will see seats fall. I think if I'm thinking about climate where I wasn't thinking it was going to be, I'm actually surprised at Wannon, because it's not just the insurance and the climate and the extreme weather event there. I think they've also really been influenced again by gas and by proposals for seismic blasting, which I'm not going to go into because I'm not an expert on it, but I just know that when I've been looking at the colour and movement in that electorate, there's been protests and grassroots activities happening all across the electorate, and they always seem to be standing by the water saying that, well, using our line, which is great, which is that big gas is taking the piss. Always good to see your own copy on somebody else's poster. But yeah, also massive pushback against the seismic blasting. So I was really interested in that. Thought that was, and Cowper, I don't know as much about. I thought that Kaz was going to run a good campaign. I thought that she was going to do quite well, but Amy's probably in a better position to talk about how and if climate's played in that electorate.
And sorry, you just to bring you back to Fremantle, there's an event coming up you wanted to talk about in Fremantle before the election?
Yes, there is. Thank you, Glenn. So our executive director, Richard Dennis, is going across to Fremantle. The event name is Burned by Big Fossil Fuels. It's a free event. It'll be on Monday, April the 28th at 6:30, and it's at the City of Fremantle Town Hall. Now, this is a return appearance by Richard Dennis. He's been going over to WA for quite some time, so it just happens to be in a couple of weeks, but this is about at least the second, if not the third time that Richard's been over there talking about gas and the gas industry and the impact it's having on Australia's economics, but also not just Australia, but the planet's climate. Yeah.
Okay. Amy, wanted to talk about independence. You've referred to a lot of the candidates in this election. What about those who've made it in the past? The major parties will tell us, independents are useless because they have no chance of being part of a government. So would you say people like Jackie Lambie, David Pocock, Andrew Wilkie, or any of the Teals have been useless in the past 3 years?
I mean, we're talking about them, so obviously they haven't. And the major parties are working very, very hard to say, please don't give us a hung parliament. So you can see the power there, because the power of the crossbench it's twofold. One, there's the very obvious power that, in a minority parliament, they are called upon to negotiate bills in the House of Representatives as well as in the Senate, because we very rarely have a major party in control of the Senate. So we constantly, in that sense, have a hung parliament, because the major party can only ever get their bill through negotiation. And if the other major party is saying no, as has been the case plenty of times in this parliament, also plenty of the times where they've been bipartisan, when they definitely want to lock out the crossbench. And you can say the nature positive laws are a great example of that, getting rid of, any negotiation on the EPA by basically just saying it's the coalition or no one. They have to negotiate with the crossbench in the Senate, and the House of Representative Teals and Community Independents have worked very closely with Jackie Lambie and David Pocock and the Greens in the Senate to ensure that there's kind of a consensus when they're moving forward. So even though the House of Representative crossbench in this parliament hasn't had the balance of power in the House of Representatives, they have managed to change the conversation as well as negotiate with the Senate. So which is the other side. So yep, there is the very obvious, that's how you do it on the votes. But the second way that they do it is that they manage to find a way to divert the national attention away from the big party messages. And so we saw that with Cathy McGowan when she took it from Sophie Mirabella, when she took Indi from Sophie Mirabella. She was able to put things on the agenda just because the media suddenly was all like, oh my God, we've had a David and Goliath battle and this independent has managed to slay Goliath, and maybe we should listen to them on things. We've seen Andrew Wilkie manage to do that in his time in Parliament as an independent. He changes the national conversation, and particularly when it comes to Tasmanian issues, but also around issues of integrity like the NAC. That was something that Andrew Wilkie was on well before the major parties were on board. We've seen it with, independents in the Senate for some time. We saw it during the 43rd Parliament, where you had, the three independents that Labor had to negotiate there with the House of Representatives. Independents do manage to change the conversation, and they get more people thinking about the bigger issues because they're reflecting what their community wants. And they're able to reflect what their community wants because they're not worried about advancement within their political party, which is one of the biggest issues that communities who have a high-profile major party MP deal with. They find that their access to that MP tends to be limited because they're always off trying to basically get higher in the party, because that's the way that you get a ministry and that's the way that you become Prime Minister. Independents are not going to become Prime Minister. They're basically only there to represent their community, which is why you have community independents holding way more public forums. They're more available on electorate days. They're only responding to what their community wants. David Pocock often holds forums in Canberra to ask people how he should vote on particular issues. Jackie Lambie has done that quite extensively as well. The Teals have all basically maintained that direct line of communication with their communities. And that is why independents are so hard to get out once they are established within it. And we've also seen that in Mayo with Rebecca Sharkey, who took that from the Liberals years ago. And that is no longer even spoken about as a potential Liberal seat because Rebecca Sharkey is so popular within her local community because she's available to them. And so that's the other thing that independents are doing, is that they're changing voters' minds about the power of people in politics and the influence that they can have on their politics, as well as changing those national conversations.
Can I
Leanne?
pick up on? Oh, sorry, Glenn. So
No, go on, please.
Oh, Glenn is having a hard time getting a word in edgeways between Amy and I, but I was having a look at the webinar chat, and I think picking up on one of Amy's points around that the independents can raise issues that the major parties just aren't going to. We've already spoken about insurance, so they're going to be doing that. But one of the people on the webinar in the chat have asked, what about the link between climate change and national security? And there was a report done, and maybe if Hannah or Angus is on the line, they could put a link up in the chat to where the report has been reported on, because a report was done looking at how climate change will impact our national security. It was kept private. It's never been made public. It has been shown to the crossbench. It's been shown to all MPs, but it hasn't been shown to the public, which I find completely outrageous, completely outrageous. So there is an issue that climate change will impact our national security, but for some reason the parliamentarians think that it's something that we shouldn't know about. I think that if we have a strong crossbench after the next election, that one of the top things that they'll be asking for is that this report be made public, or at least a redacted version of it. It is completely outrageous when we're talking about issues of national security that we are being kept completely in the dark as citizens, and it is only the crossbench and the Greens, who are obviously part of the crossbench, but it's the Greens and the independents who are going to force the major parties into allowing us to see what the whole picture is. And I tell you what, if we start seeing how much of an impact climate change is going to have on our national security and on our insurance, I think people are going to start getting a whole lot angrier at the subsidies that fossil fuel industry is currently getting, and that is has to be part of the reason why we're being kept in the dark about this. It's not because our nerves or our, our emotions can't stand knowing the truth. It's to absolutely protect vested interests.
And we know that they're responding to that report because some of you may remember there is the Tuvalu climate refugee deal that has been put in place, where Australia's basically gone, sorry that we're being so crap on climate and then you're going to have a direct impact with your island going underwater. Don't worry, we'll take you into Australia. So the government is actually making plans based on this report and others because of the climate risk, while not telling the Australian public what that climate risk is. And again, as Leanne said, if it wasn't for the crossbench constantly raising this, I think Monique Ryan was asking questions in the tail end of the parliament, or Zali, or one of the independents was still asking questions about it, it would just fall off the radar, because politics is so full and journalists are so so overwhelmed with the daily news cycle that politicians can use it to their advantage to basically just push things off the agenda. It is having people in the parliament who are focused on issues that their communities are focused on that keeps things in the public consciousness.
Leanne, can I ask you about the Greens? At the start of the campaign, the noises from the major parties were very much that they were going to be targeting those 3 Queensland seats that were picked up in 2022. In terms of that Greens success of 2022, can we expect it to all come undone in a few weeks?
Well, that's a very good question, and one I haven't given a great deal of thought to. But look, who knows? And we will know in 3 weeks. I think it's great. If you thought about it 20 years ago, the Greens would never have been having a discussion about sandbagging existing seats. So I think if we take a longer view look, the fact that we have Greens sandbagging lower house electorates was literally something that would never have come into the minds of Greens voters or politicians even 10 years ago. So I think what we can take from it, though, is that it's not a blip. So the Greens vote is actually going up. In the last Queensland state election, everyone makes a big noise about the fact that they lost a seat or a couple of seats. I can't remember what it is. Amy will probably know better than me, being a Queenslander. But what people talked less about was that I think their vote, it either held or went up slightly. So the Green vote is increasing across the country, but you may or may not get the centralised or the amount of votes needed to get to win a particular electorate. So we'll see what happens. I think everybody's saying that Max Chandler-Mather looks like he'll pretty well get his seat back, and who knows what will happen with the other 2 seats. What I do like about it is that having both major parties launch in Brisbane showed that they were seats that they were after. And even though they tried really, really hard not to talk about it, everybody knows that those 3 seats were won off the back of voter concerns around climate and issues of inequality. So I think for me, that is the more interesting story than will they hold the 3 seats. But I completely accept that that is not the story that everybody's going to concentrate on. And that's why people have to come to the Australia Institute for the real analysis.
Amy, let's look, particularly if you think about the seat of Brisbane and Stephen Bates and how he fell in there. People don't quite get that our voting system is quite fabulous when it comes to creating these sorts of contests, and maybe don't really understand how a 3-way contest really works and how it can work in the favour occasionally of an independent or a minor party candidate.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and it's a wider question of why we don't teach civics in this nation. And I think part of the reason is that the major parties don't want people to actually understand how the electoral system works when they vote, because it's to their benefit to basically snow people that a vote for anyone else but us is going to mean the opposite extreme, which is not true in the Australian context. And we saw that a lot directly after the Trump election, where you saw people start to go, we can't criticise Labor because we'll get Dutton. That is not how our voting system works. You can vote against a particular political party, but as long as you're putting whoever it is in that particular political party above the person in the political party you don't want to get in, you are directing your preference away from the opposite extreme to whatever it is that you want. And in those 3-pronged contests that we saw in Brisbane, in Ryan, in Griffith, in some of the Sydney seats where the Teals won, in some of the Victorian seats like Kooyong, is that you had, when Labor wanted a Teal to win over the Liberals, they basically played dead, but ensured that their preferences would flow to the independent candidate, which would get them over the line against their challenger at the time, that was the Liberal candidate. And we're still seeing that play in. So basically, if you're a Labor voter in a seat where an independent is challenging a Liberal, you were told to put vote for Labor as you usually do, but then make sure that your preferences flow through to the independent and then put the Liberal down last. That was Labor's strategy. When it came to what the Greens were doing, where Labor was really actually challenging the Greens, like particularly in Griffith, which they lost to the Greens, but also, you know, they in Brisbane and in Ryan, which Labor thought they could win. They underestimated that voters there actually understood how preferential voting works. And so what they didn't realise is that people were saying, okay, we actually want somebody different to the major parties, so we're going to direct our votes so that Labor preferences end up helping the Greens. And that's pretty much what happened. But crucially, Liberal preferences also ended up helping the Greens, because people were basically saying, we're not in love with what you're doing, major parties, and we want to change. And that change has been coming through in Queensland for some time. It came through in the state election as well, where Michael Berkman took a seat very similar to Ryan in the state context from the Liberals. The Teals haven't had as much impact in Queensland yet, because it's mostly the Greens who have been filling that space. And the Greens have been providing, you know, what the Teals have provided in other areas. But we are now seeing in those inner city seats, you've got highly educated voters who do understand how civics work, who are directing their protest votes to the Greens rather than the major parties, because of everything that Leanne has previously identified, which is that the major parties are not addressing their concerns. And in areas like Ryan, where you're financially astute enough or settled enough, at least according to, you know, the demographic information from the AEC, you can afford to care about climate change over cost of living, because, you know, you're set up. And that is what is happening in the inner cities. We're seeing young people who are very focused on it because it's directly impacting them or their children, and older people who are focused on it because they're already financially settled, but thinking about their own children and grandchildren. And it's something that the major parties are missing. And I'm seeing a few people in there talking about Max Chandler Mather in Griffith. Again, it's this is an election. I know that everyone says this, but this is an election of really of 150 different fights. And one of the fights in Griffith is about, yes, cost of living and climate, but it's also about the popularity of the local member. And what the major parties have missed is that Max Chandler Mather is a popular local member. He has basically spent $50,000 of his own politician wage financing a school's meals program for the moment that he got elected. He's always involved in community events. Him turning up to help after the cyclone wasn't an accident. It's what he has been doing since the moment he was elected, because Max Chandler Mather has been involved in political campaigns since he was young adult, first in Labor and then later in the Greens. He ran Greens state campaigns. He was the campaign manager for Amy McMahon for many years. He understands the community, and he is playing to the community's needs because he is a member of that community, and that is what he is focused on. So the Greens today have announced that they're taking his school meals program national, that they would like to see that in all schools and to tax major corporations in order to pay for it. But the major parties have pretty much missed that it's the work that independents and Greens MPs like Max Chandler Mather in their communities that is really attractive to the communities. And that's not really something that a lot of major party candidates can offer.
We're getting obviously got a lot of people in Queensland on this webinar.
Greatest nation on earth. Wow.
few comments about what Leanne said about launching their campaigns there. I think Leanne wasn't saying the official launch; they actually started their campaigns. And interestingly,
they started the campaign. Yeah.
Well, Albo started his campaign in the seat of Dixon, and I've seen a few questions and comments about Dixon here. Amy, is there any chance Dixon could fall to Labor?
Look, I'm never ruling out a chance because I'm never getting ahead of the voters. They're always the one who will make the decision. I can tell you historically, though, that when the Liberals are on the nose, Dixon becomes exceptionally marginal, but does fall over the line, and has for the last 24 years that Dutton has been in the Parliament. When the Liberals are on an upswing, it gets a little bit safer. So while Ali France is running a very good ground campaign there, It is unlikely that Peter Dutton will lose his seat. It'll just stay as a marginal seat. However, that doesn't mean that it will be forever, because Peter Dutton is on track to lose this election. A Labor-led minority is still the most likely outcome according to the polls. If Peter Dutton loses the election and doesn't win back a buttload of seats for the coalition, and the number that's been said to me by members of the Liberal Party is that he would need to win at least 65. I think they're about 57 now. At least 65 to be safe, 68 to be guaranteed safe, which would be about, 10 or so. That's with no losses. There is every chance that Peter Dutton may not be the leader after this next election if they do lose. If he's not the leader, that kind of cuts down a lot of his ambitions. Does he stick around then? Who knows? And that is when Dutton's seat of Dixon will come into play. And that is when the independents and, everyone else will be able to look at what is happening in Dixon. And I will also remind people that when Peter Dutton first won pre-selection for Dixon back in the early 2000s, and I think it was Cheryl Kerno who he took the seat from, and there was a whole big kerfuffle over, changing parties and everything that happened around that time. He challenged Karen Andrews, who had won the seat of McPherson in the Gold Coast, to try to take that seat from her because he was so worried about having to maintain a Liberal marginal seat. So it's always been a consideration for him that he's in charge of a Liberal marginal seat. He has never managed to make it a safe seat. Him leaving will probably be what turns Dixon, but probably not this election.
You heard it here first. Dixon to fall in maybe November by-election. Leanne, I want to come back to what we saw in the last few days, that three-day sitting week around the budget. The government, with the support of the opposition, rammed through changes to our election laws, which, reading between the lines, was pretty much aimed at making it harder for minor parties and independents. What does that say about how afraid the major parties are of this trend away from them?
Well, clearly they are afraid, but I also, Glenn, just a few people have put on the chat, can we answer some questions, please? So maybe we should go to some of the questions. I think probably at the last election, Labor Party were able to sit back and have a bit of a chuckle at the Teals taking the Liberal seats. But the problem for them now is whatever colour you want to call them, there's now independents going for the Labor seats. And I think from a climate perspective, at the last election, it was, can we please get rid of the coalition? They're really bad on climate and Labor will do something more. At this election, it is, well, Labor hasn't done enough. They're still backing the fossil fuel industry. And so climate-based climate-focused independents, and we went through some of them before, but if you just look at it, there's ministers, there's Julie Collins, there's Tanya Plibersek, and I'm not saying all these seats will fall, but I'm saying these are Labor seats that are now under challenge from climate-focused independents. So we've also got Josh, I hope I get his name right, because there's two Joshes both under threat. One is Wilson in Fremantle and the other one is Josh somebody Burns in McNamara. So whereas before Labor might have been able to sit back and have a chuckle, this is good because there's climate independence focused on the Liberals. Well, this time around, they're coming for Labor as well. So it's no surprise that both of the major parties, and I did notice one of the questions that have really been voted up is why aren't the major parties talking about issues of climate and how it relates to cost of living? Well, surprise, surprise, if they did that, they would then have to talk about why they're not doing things like stopping subsidies to fossil fuels, why they're not doing things like agreeing on, when is the last date that Australia will open up a new gas field or coal mine? I would just love a politician to tell me that, because they all say that we can't keep doing it. No one's there. I'm not even saying let's close down the industry that exists. I'm saying I'm not even, just give me a date. Give me a date when they'll open up the last one. They can't, they won't. That's why they won't talk about things in the climate in the context of cost of living, because they've wedged themselves and they're poor little buggers. They just don't know where to go with it.
Poor little buggers. All right, question from Sean. What will it take to have climate spoken about across the country as an issue in the national interest?
every voter making it an issue. I mean, like, politicians only respond to voters' screams. It's the one thing that they can't ignore. I mean, like, if you go back to what happened in 2019 with the bushfires and Scott Morrison not holding a hose, the reason that there was such a huge, like, just scream at the coalition then is because everyone could see what was happening. We saw images of children in boats looking at flames, you know, trying to protect themselves from the water. In Canberra, the first breath of babies born in the hospital was smoke-filled because there was so much smoke around from the surrounding bushfires. It was penetrating into hospital delivery rooms. Everyone saw the terror of these bushfires that just absolutely impacted communities in a way that they're still trying to recover from. Then we had the floods in Coffs Harbour and northern New South Wales and southern Gold Coast, which again terrified people. So it's voters screaming at their representatives to say, this matters to me. And I know that it does matter to people because I speak to people every single day. They send me messages and say, why are they not talking about this? You have to make them talk about it. You have to vote on it. You have to tell them it is the issue that matters to you, because they are going to continue to open up fossil fuel mines. They're going to continue on this track that we need more gas fields and all the other furfies and bullshit that they tell us as truisms, until voters become louder than the vested interest of the fossil fuel industry. Because at the moment, that is who they're listening to, and that's the messages that they are regurgitating, and they need to actually hear voters saying, we are going to punish you for this, which is what happened in the WA state election. It's not being talked about because, you know, it's off the main game, I suppose. It's off the boil, and the media industry often takes climate with a bit of skepticism because they don't believe that it matters to voters, because they talk to politicians who tell them that it doesn't matter. But we know that it does. And so you have to be the ones to make them change their minds.
Amy, I reckon I love Richard's saying here about politicians respond to two things: pain and the threat of pain. So
Yep.
We've got a question about AUKUS, I think picking up from Richard on Q&A last night, and just basically the use of taxpayers' money and priorities. Leanne.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard any of the major parties commit to doing a review of AUKUS. We've done polling here to ask people how they feel about that. And again, I'd encourage people to go to the website, because I haven't got this particular, I've got some climate polling in front of me, but not AUKUS. Australians are worried about our national security, and they're also worried about how much we're already tied to the US. When given the option in our research of asking Australians, would they feel safer with more cooperation, you know, a closer relationship with the US, or a more independent national foreign policy, they always go to a more independent foreign policy. And that's becoming more so the crazier that Trump gets. And I don't think we can expect crazier to, you know, we can't expect Trump to be less crazy in the near future. And we've done a lot of work on showing what a dud AUKUS is as a deal. And I think it's actually a really good example where politicians are just, you know, believing their own press, because anybody who looks at AUKUS sees that it's a really bad deal. Malcolm Turnbull said that it's a bad deal. We're unlikely to ever get the subs anyway. There's a lot of money tied up in it. Donald Trump will probably back the deal because it's a really good one for them, so why not? But again, it goes back to Amy's point. If the politicians don't believe that this is a big issue to the voting people of Australia, they are not going to change their mind on it. And unfortunately, on national security, I wish the two major parties would do it on climate change. Imagine if climate change was treated in the same way as AUKUS. Imagine if both the national parties came together and said, rather than worry about an invading army that may or may not come, let's work out how we protect ourselves against a tsunami of climate impacts that we are 100% sure will be coming. and we are going to have a bipartisan position on that. And you know what? It's not that unusual because it happens in other countries. It happens in Europe. It's been happening in, you know, Boris Johnson was
the
more
UK.
progressive on the climate issue than any of our politicians have been of any colour except Green. I mean, of the two majors. So that's what I would love to see. And whoever put the question up, I didn't see the question, but I think AUKUS is just a prime example of Australian political idiocy.
Question from Gavin to Amy, looking for an insight as to what makes politicians tick, to somebody who speaks to them every day. Interesting part of the question, are they immune to hypocrisy, Amy?
No.
Ouch.
Power is what makes them tick. You know, and that's true of any political stripe. It's power. I mean, even with the independents and the Greens, they're responding to community concerns that have basically been vacated by the major parties. But there is also power in that because they're rising voices. So power is, and so that is how you see politicians start to move on issues where, you know, like suddenly, like Peter Dutton is saying, oh, we don't have a gas shortage. We can do everything with the gas that we've got. This is not something he would have said 3 years ago. He's saying it because he's basically responding to his base, you know, in areas like regional Queensland, where they're saying, why are we sending so much of our gas overseas? Why are we sending 82% of it overseas when we could be, you know, keeping it for us? I don't understand. So he's responding to this weird strain of nationalism that is actually good for the climate. It's like, you know, we need to actually start thinking of ourselves first. And you're also seeing that with Anthony Albanese and Labor with their, you know, Future Made in Australia policy, which essentially is Curtin Chifley's policy to bring manufacturing into Australia, but they're just calling it a different thing, and they're essentially just focusing on, you know, renewable technology and the new industries revolving around critical minerals. But what Anthony Albanese is saying is that we need to bring manufacturing back to Australia because, oh God, we all just saw what happened in the pandemic, and when you don't have access to supply chains, that's really, really bad for you. So we need to respond to that because that's what people want. So the moment that people start asking these questions and they become loud enough to ask these questions, that's when you start to see politicians change. And there was a really interesting event in Tasmania, and I forget which seat it was, where the Labor candidate, might have been Braddon, Leanne, the Labor candidate was asked on ABC radio if she supported getting rid of the native forest logging industry, and her instinct was to say yes. She didn't like, you know, native
Bass.
logging. Yeah, sorry, Bass, thank you. Didn't like native logging. Immediately gets a phone call from Labor HQ that just is like, Labor's policy is not to get rid of logging in Tasmania. And suddenly she's on board with the logging industry. So yes, politicians are very open to hypocrisy because they go where the power goes. You just have to change it from being the party power dynamic to the public power dynamic.
And I
Leanne?
think just on the forestry issue, I think sometimes it's overlooked a lot with climate. One of the easiest things that we can do to protect our climate is just to stop the idiocy of native forest logging. It costs us money, it costs the planet. Tasmania is a net I mean, Tasmania are their carbon accounting, it looks pretty good. And it looks good because they because they don't have fossil fuels, it's hydro and renewables, and because they partially protected their native forest estate. So in a climate challenged world, why we're still knocking down native forests and not protecting our koalas and all of the species that Australians really love and identify with and as part of who we are, again, just shows the hold, really, that vested interests have over our politicians, and it's not good enough. It's time for them to be brave and start being as brave as we are, actually, and protect what we love, not destroy it.
Yeah, what do you say, Leanne? Make Australia brave again? Yeah.
We are running out of time, but I've got a question for Leanne on the teal movement, the success of women candidates off the back of women voters in moderate Liberal seats. Moderate voters in Liberal seats. Do you expect that to continue here in 2025?
Yeah, I think it will. I don't think that, I mean, and again, it depends on, I think Amy said earlier, watch the results, not just the seats. So, I mean, again, to win Parliament, you've got to win seats, obviously. But if you want to look at the broader political mood and what issues are holding and how people are voting, you can't do that just by watching what seats fell where. You have to watch how people are voting. And I actually can't imagine women at home thinking, I'm going to vote for I want more women in politics. I want better policy for women. I want, action on climate. And I want more integrity. They're the things that women voted for in these seats. Now, what is going to happen in the past 3 years? They may not vote for the same candidate again. The seat may well change hands. But if you're looking at an overall trend, are women suddenly not going to care about those 4 things? My answer to that would be no bloody way.
Okay, we are almost out of time. Let's wrap up. Amy, let's go back to the original question. Is there any such thing as a safe seat in 2025?
No, there is no such thing as a safe seat in 2025. There hasn't been such a thing as a safe seat in quite some time in Australia. The primary vote of the majors has continued to fall. They've got 3s in front of them. That's not too long until they'll have 2s in front of them. So it's entirely what voters do. And make sure you protect preferential voting. It is one of the strongest tools you have to protect Australia against the insanity that we are seeing in the United States.
Thanks, Amy. Leanne, let's wrap up with you also with that question. As we look ahead 2.5 weeks, is there any such thing as a safe seat?
Thanks a lot, everyone.
No.
Right.
I think that's Leanne's way of saying, no, there's not.
No, there's not.
I thought that was your wrap-up, Glenn, not a question.
No. Have I got a spiel for you?
Love for it.
Leanne's got to go change the country, Glenn. She doesn't have time for these final questions.
I'm so sorry. I thought it was wrapping up. No, there's no such thing as a safe seat. I agree with Amy. How could I ever disagree? She's just next door and I'm frightened of her. So on that note, I am going to say goodbye, and just a reminder that next week we will have Climate Academy again. We're not stay tuned for what that will be on. Feel free to text me if you want something in particular covered. We did this on purpose and didn't decide what next week was going to be. We will decide it today, but everything's moving so quickly. We wanted to be a little bit agile, but we will be back 11 o'clock next Tuesday with another Climate Academy. Hope to see some of you then.
Great. Thanks very much to both of you. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube as well to catch all of our webinars. You can subscribe to our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America. If you have any follow-up questions, send us an email at theaustraliainstitute.org.au. Please put Climate Academy as the subject. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Follow along with our blog. Follow along with our
Follow
blog
the
too.
live blog. Yeah, thousands of you are doing that. Don't forget, you can do that all the way through until the election on May 3. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.